Hello, everyone. We welcome you this morning to our Saturday morning Bible study. Today is January 26, 2019. We are recording from the Plainfield Christian Science Church Independent, Plainfield, New Jersey, the United States of America, and we are so very glad you could all join us. Our moderator today is Shardy from Pennsylvania.
Good morning. First, I'd like to read the quote from Church by Martha Wilcox, page 7. Without the understanding which Christian Science gives of the Bible, Reformation in the old days was based on fear. The Mosaic Law, with its interpretation of sin, was damnation instead of salvation. And until the revelation of Christ, condemnation and penalty governed mankind. Christianity today has retained enough of that law to keep condemnation and penalty as a prod for reformation. This is not Christian Science. Reformation is education. We do better because we know better. Paul said, quote, "For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did," end quote. That's Hebrews 7. Reformation is not achieved through outward conforming to the letter of the law, nor through fear, nor through making clean the outside of the platter, but an inner urge, an inevitable recognition of what is actual and true. End quote.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Great introduction to the Ten Commandments.
It sure is, yes. Because if there's anything wrong with the Ten Commandments, like some people think there is, of course there isn't, but some people think there is, well, this is what's wrong when you get all this guilt and condemnation wrapped up in them. And that's what people reject. But, as we'll find out today, that's not what is truly in the Ten Commandments and why they so need to be embraced and loved and lived.
Any other thoughts on this?
Well, certainly any churches that I went to when I was young, it was all condemnation and penalty as a prod for reformation. Has been very interesting.
And it didn't work out so well, did it?
It didn't work out at all.
I just like to... Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to express my gratitude to Plainfield because of the part that she says we reform through education, and that's what's going on here, and that's all these classes. And to follow these commandments without the Reformation and the being taught to understand and to love and know God so you can do this, it really was difficult to follow those. So I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, we all needed to be re-educated, didn't we?
Sure.
We at Plainfield are grateful for the re-education that Mrs. Evans gave us.
Yeah, and I think instead of looking at them as a set of punitive laws, it's rather a guidance as to how to live and love God. What a perfect way to be shown exactly what to be doing.
Yes.
Exactly. And to have a life that is a blessing.
Yeah, and I know when I was in the other religion, Presbyterian old theology religion, and even after I came into science, because I didn't really understand where one left and the other started. Anyway, I did things out of fear, afraid of God, afraid of being punished. And that's just no way to live. and it doesn't take you very far. You just can't go very far being obedient through fear. Suddenly, maybe not so suddenly, you'll end up rebelling. And that's why anyone who tries to govern through fear, it's just simply wrong. We govern through love, through understanding, yes, through the proper education. And then you want to obey, you desire to obey, and that's when you're safe. Because if you're just doing it because you're afraid of punishment, it only lasts so long, and then it explodes. And you see in some other churches where you have this, confessionals. You sin, and then you confess, and then you sin, and then you confess. And all of this wrapped up in a terrible sense of guilt, condemnation, not of God.
And those kinds of systems are perpetuated through ignorance.
I used to be very afraid sometimes as a child. I remember, I don't know, I must have been about 5 or 6 years old, and going to confession. And afterwards, I would be terrified of committing a sin. And the whole day, I kept watching myself. And, of course, being a child, I would do something that I knew was wrong. And then I would say, oh, there we go. So, I mean, I wouldn't even last an hour after confession without doing something that was supposedly wrong. And it was this fear that was instilled, from the old religion that, was, I think it was used as a way of domineering people and making people be afraid of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so, yes, they can dominate you, and then they can take your money and control you.
Yes.
Thank you, Pilar.
But it's also just ignorance. Not just a desire to dominate, but just ignorance.
Sometimes. Sometimes it's malicious, that you're talking about ignorant malpractice or malicious malpractice. And in old theology, there are both. In any ism, there are both.
So with that, Shardy?
Question number 1. What are the 10 Commandments, and where do they come from?
Well, God spoke them to the children of Israel after they came, that He helped them come over the Red Sea, and they had gone to I think it was the base of Mount Sinai. But the 10 Commandments I look at, it's their basic moral code. And we've based our laws, they call them the Judeo-Christian laws, way back then. And we're still based on those. But now with Christian Science, we have a more spiritual way of interpreting them than just basically literal.
Thank you. Who else?
Well, they originally come from Exodus 20, 1 to 17. So.
These are the rules that God gave to Moses.
Yeah, I mean, they come from God. We have to know their source is that.
So they are divine. And as someone said, they are the rules that should govern and guide our behavior. There's a reason behind each one of them that is for our benefit. They were given to the children of Israel shortly after their release from slavery in Egypt, and before they reached the land that God promised that He would lead them to. These were the rules they were going to have to live by if they wanted to keep what God was going to give them.
for their protection and really showing how much love God is, expressing towards them. Like a parent, giving your children some things to go by because you love them. You don't want them to go in any trouble. You say, do this and do this and do that.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's from love.
Moses spent time alone with God. Actually, it was a fair amount of time. And the fact that he got him in that scenario obviously proves our divine source, but it also indicates the sacred nature of that event, of getting them. So this was quiet time with God that he got these things. There weren't any other influences, voices or distractions going on at that particular time. Moses and God spoke, and Moses received. That was, in my view, a very sacred event.
I'd like to add something from Charles. Was there somebody else?
Go ahead, Betty.
From Charles Spurgeon, I looked it up on the internet about the Ten Commandments, and I'd like to quote this from part of it. Quote, "It is a perfect law in which the interests of God and man are both studied. It is not a partial law, but impartial, complete, and covering all the circumstances of life. You could not take away one command out of the 10 without spoiling both tables of the law, and you could not add another command without being guilty of making a superfluity. The law is holy and just and good. It is like the God who made it. It is a perfect law."
That's it.
Beautiful. Thank you. You should put that on the forum, Betty.
Okay, I will.
One of the writers pointed out that in Deuteronomy 5:22, it says that the words of the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain in the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness with a loud voice. And then, that was a profound time. That wasn't just collecting a couple of stones with words on it. The writer went on to say that when you drive on a switchback on a mountain path, do you curse the guardrails that keep you from plunging to an untimely death? No, someone put them there at great expense and for our good, that we may travel about freely and safely. The Ten Commandments aren't instructions on how to get out of Egypt. They are rules for a free people to stay free.
Thank you. That's very well said. I think we can go through them one at a time rather than list them all now. So, can anyone else on this one, where it came from or about commandments?
I just like to say, not long ago, some of us in the church watched the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, and I can't help but think of the Ten Commandments without thinking of that scene where he got them. It was very good.
Before we go on to question 2, which is that's question 2. Everything is said above is the rules, this is a quote, to preserve monotheism. Yeah. And then question number 2. What commandment is talked about in Deuteronomy 11:13?
Someone should read it.
I can read it.
Go ahead.
"And it shall come to pass, if ye shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the Lord your God, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul."
Thank you. What commandment?
The first.
Mm-hmm. Now, I said a week or so ago when I was raised that the one thing that my mother raised me on were the 10 Commandments. But I have to say, I had no idea what the first commandment meant. So superficially that, well, you don't serve other gods. And of course I didn't, because I didn't live back in that time where I was doing that sort of thing. But Mrs. Eddy brings new life and meaning to this commandment, and we must go over it because it is highly important. What does she say? Someone can read it on page 340 of Science and Health about the first commandment being her favorite text. Isn't that what she says? And who has a Science and Health? That's me. Jeremy?
I think so.
The last paragraph.
Last paragraph. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Exodus 23. The first commandment is my favorite text. It demonstrates Christian science. It inculcates the triunity of God, spirit, mind. It signifies that man shall have no other spirit or mind but God, eternal good, and that all men shall have one mind. The divine principle of the first commandment bases the science of being, by which man demonstrates health, holiness, and life eternal. One infinite God, good, unifies men and nations, constitutes the brotherhood of man, ends wars, fulfills the scripture, love thy neighbor as thyself, annihilates pagan and Christian idolatry, whatever is wrong in social, civil, criminal, political, and religious codes, equalizes the sexes, annuls the curse on man, and leaves nothing that can sin, suffer, be punished, or destroyed.
Wow.
Wow.
Yep.
It covers it all, doesn't it?
Maybe someone read the first commandment, Bruce.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
That one little sentence.
Sometimes the shortest statements leave the most impact.
You're right.
Yes, but who else but Mrs. Eddy could get what we just heard read by Jeremy out of that short little statement? That just is very awesome.
You're right. It is. It is. There's such depth to this commandment. Now, she says that if you're dealing with fear, you take the first commandment and chop its head off. This first commandment is so powerful because in so many ways we make other gods. We talk about it almost every week here, but we make these other gods. And it's not just these idols of times past, but present-day idols. And whenever you fear anything, you are believing that there's a power apart from God. Therefore, you are disobeying this commandment. And that always is like throwing cold water on me when I realize if I'm afraid of something that I'm going down this wrong path. And it wakes me up.
You're worshiping a false god.
Yes.
Yes, you're dishonoring God. You should feel uncomfortable.
Yes. Yeah, you should. You will. You'll suffer for it. You will suffer for it until you stop it.
Right. And that discomfort that you just mentioned, or that suffering that you feel, is a safety. It's a safety for us. God's way of telling us, no, you don't want to go there. And didn't Jesus imply very clearly the importance of the first commandment?
Jesus lived it.
He lived it.
Completely.
When someone asked him about it, Jesus turned it right back and said, well, what's written? The guy said, well, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and all thy mind. The second one, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Jesus' explanation was this. All of the commandments are contained in these two commandments. Well, it covers everything, and you're right. It took Mrs. Eddy to explain how it covers everything.
In their article, in an article called Sight, it's by an A. Kroger. It's on our website, and it's discussing sight. It's discussing someone who was born blind and was healed of it. But there's a very important paragraph in there. It's one of my favorite articles. I love it. But it says, the cause of all loss and suffering is not because matter is diseased, but because of the breaking of the commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Spirit. Keep the first commandment. In this case, separate sight from matter, restore it to mind where it belongs, and all fear and suffering depart. Think of that. And this is what Mrs. Eddy says throughout her writings, just said in a different way. The cause of all loss and suffering is not because matter is diseased, but because of the breaking of the commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Spirit. Keep the first commandment. Separate sight from matter. Restore it to mind where it belongs, and all fear and suffering depart. That's the depth of this commandment as Mrs. Eddy gives it to us. So this is speaking of sight, but you can say anything. Separate
any necessary function from matter. Put it in mind where it belongs, where it really, truly exists. Then you begin to see things clearly. That is what heals.
Now, I don't know of anywhere, but as Janet said, only science explains this commandment, and actually all the commandments as we go through them in this depth. And that's why, and it's being said today that the commandments are irrelevant. They don't apply anymore. And even this idea that Jesus, the two commandments are enough. Well, Spurgeon goes into that quite thoroughly, and he says the two commandments of Jesus are actually much more difficult to do, because he's talking about your thought. He's going really deep. I mean, you might try to obey these commandments in a literal way. I'm not going to steal, or I'm not going to kill, or whatever. But when you get into what the Christ is saying, it's much deeper. But they're all important. And I looked up all that Mrs. Eddy said about the commandments, and believe me, she says this. She says the Decalogue is very important, that we know it and we live it. I'll read some parts of that at some point, but this isn't something that was important years ago and is no longer important, and that means all of them. If you had a rail guard, as Linda was talking about, and every once in a while there's a huge gap so you can fall off the cliff, and then you go back to the rail guard again. No, the rail guard is all along the road in every instance. And anyone who rationalizes why one of these commandments is not important merely does not know what they are talking about. As Fairley said earlier, it is ignorance. And it is so sad that these, to a large degree, commandments are not being taught the way they should be taught. Because it's leading to a very secular society, which is leading to a lot of other unhappy situations.
Mrs. Eddy says that the law was never to be abrogated. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but that means repealed or annulled. A divine statute for yesterday and today and forever.
Thank you. Yes.
So we lose the love of God if we don't obey them. Certainly, obeying them will draw us nearer, will make us feel His love. But we surely don't feel it if we are not obeying Him.
Thank you.
I mean, the love is there, but we can't feel it. We block our own view from it.
That's right. Our disobedience.
And as you said earlier, it is our only source of security. Disobey the commandments, you're not going to feel very secure, and you shouldn't.
And this is why so many people feel anxious.
Right.
It is certainly why I used to feel anxious. This is such an important aspect of science to understand and to live. You will feel anxious if you think there's a power apart from God and you fear it. Why wouldn't you? Of course you would. There is only the one God. And that means one mind, one love, one law, one spirit, just the one. And so you won't be finding others, and you can easily slip into it if you're not alert and watchful, which is why we do what we do. In Miscellany, Mrs. Eddy says, I am asked, is there a hell? Yes, there is a hell for all who persist in breaking the golden rule or in disobeying the commandments of God. Physical science has sometimes argued that the internal fires of our earth will eventually consume this planet. Christian science shows that hidden, unpunished sin is this internal fire, even the fire of a guilty conscience, waking to a true sense of itself and burning in torture until the sinner is consumed, his sins destroyed. This may take millions of cycles, but the time no man knoweth. The advanced psychic knows that this hell is mental, not material, and that the Christian has no part in it. Only the makers of hell burn in their own fire. Now that is refreshingly clear.
Right. You set your own fire.
You set your own fire. You do. You do. So how important it is to take heed of these commandments, the rail guards. Keep us on the road. And if we find ourselves burning in some kind of a hell, you can ask, well, what commandments have I disobeyed? Maybe purposely, maybe unwittingly. The first one is an easy one to disobey unless you truly understand it. We've talked about it much, but I hope everyone, I'll be happy to go into it more if you need this deeper understanding of this first commandment.
I think there's another.
They should be taught to our children. They should be displayed on the front of every courthouse in every city in this country.
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
There's a neighbor in my neighborhood who has the Ten Commandments in their yard next to the American flag. It's been there for 3 or 4 years now.
Good old Georgia.
All right.
Amen to that.
Right.
Oh, goodness.
But really, in every nation that Christianity is there, it should be somewhere where people are reminded of it. I mean, Christianity claims to be in so many different countries, too. So what is it? Without the commandments, how are people living it?
Well,
I found
it's for all mankind, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Most
it's so,
definitely.
It's totally basic. It should be in every nation, everywhere in the world. Absolutely.
I wanted to mention I found a poll on the internet that was done last year, and it was percentage who say each commandment is still important to live by today, and it was the United States versus the UK. And for that first commandment, 59% of the U.S. said it was important, 30% did not. And then 20% of British people said it was important, and 68% it was no longer an important principle to live by.
Wow.
That's surprising.
Thank you.
And look what's happening there.
Yeah, and how is that working out for them?
Not.
Not, no.
There's a context also. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There's also a context if you think about where the Israelites were, that they had been basically functioning as slaves for 400 years. It's like being in prison, and all of a sudden they were free. They were marching out of their prisoner country with untold riches, and there was nothing to replace, at least immediately, the confines or the parameters of the way they lived. So that concept of the guardrails, I think, is a really good one. That God was, in a sense, I mean, he was creating a nation of free people from a nation of slaves. I mean, that's no easy task. And so providing a guardrail, a way of living, something to live by that was replacing the entire structure of their existence for many generations was a daunting task. And I think it just looking back at it historically, it doesn't take 40 years to get from Egypt to Israel. But basically, God needed to replace an entire generation of slaves with an entire generation of free people. And this is how he did it. He took 40 years of having to live by the Ten Commandments to create a new nation.
That's a great point. Thank you. That's a great point, because this is what it takes. And it doesn't take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rules and regulations, which is what our government likes to give us. All you have to do is obey the Ten Commandments, and all of this will work out for the best.
But I think that's the huge point here is who teaches it correctly. Christ Jesus and Mary Baker Eddy. And let's take 1 + 1 = 2. If Einstein hadn't learned that right in the beginning, would he have ever gotten any of his great theories correct?
Right.
Well, and let's remember, these are rules that govern the universe. These are fundamental. It may have seemed a little daunting to Moses at the time, because they weren't readily accepted by everybody right away. But it wasn't daunting to God at all.
And actually, 40 years isn't all that long a period to make this such a huge change. You can see, God's word is mighty and powerful. And when applied, it can change things.
Change them quickly.
It can change it quickly. Yes, it can.
Well, if they couldn't do it, he wouldn't have given them.
That's it.
But I got to say, after 15 years of Christian Science, I still find it daunting. You know, it's what we've been trained into in the past that makes it tough, but that's no excuse on my part.
Well, yeah. And God worketh in you, through you, to accomplish his good purpose. So what's daunting to man, as Gary just said, it's never daunting to God as we get rid of our false sense of selfhood, and give ourselves to him.
And patiently wait God's perfection be revealed. Yeah.
Yeah, Carol said one step at a time.
I mean, you read Psalms, it talks about God's wisdom is unsearchable, things like that. Well, is there anybody that knows everything there is to know about God? No. So, life's not a destination, it's a journey.
But those statistics that Elizabeth gave us are very sobering, and this is why we are still a Christian nation and why we must be watchful about what's going on.
For our own sake, for the sake of the world, for the sake of mankind. That's why we do this.
And I think it's true. I've always felt, people in all parts of the country, or the world, absolutely the world, maybe have never even heard of the Bible. And yet many people have this conscience, these rules within them. I think most people know that killing is wrong. Most people know that stealing is wrong. I mean, they have a basic sense of morality within them, which is encouraging, because that's the oneness of mind and God.
That's the way they were created by God.
That's how they were.
That's what God created, and that's what's real.
Yes.
And that's what's true.
But some of them, like covet, people may do that. That's not quite as obvious.
Right, and there are, that all of us, as was just said by Mike, all of us can apply all of this to a much greater and deeper degree, and we should be, and we will be, and we'll, again, the educating process. So any more questions or comments on the first commandment? Spend a lot of time just thinking about what Mrs. Eddy says about it. What a freeing commandment it is. And again, very often is that what I quoted from the article site. If you are having a problem, the problem is probably that you are disobeying the first commandment. You are believing that there is another God, a power other than the one God. And if you get back to that basic point, it is like going back, as someone just said, 2 + 2 is 4. It's a basic fact. You go back to that. That's your compass. Okay, where did I get off here? What am I believing? Am I believing in poverty or misery or sickness or relationship problems? Go back to the first commandment. Go back to that. One God.
When we started doing the Bible studies on Revelation, Mary said to read the beast from Eustace, and in there he talks about seeing matter not as substance but as shadow, and that shadow will turn you to the truth. So I'm thinking of that a lot.
Thank you. Okay, are we ready to move on then to the next commandment?
Actually, I was looking very quickly because we talked about Revelation, and Revelation 12, the last line said, "And the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ."
Wow, thank you. That's why the resistance, all of this was coming out as just part of it. And they will twist and turn things around to get their agenda approved. And it's going on today.
I don't think a lot of people really realize that they make God out of like medicine or money and stuff. That's first and foremost in their mind. I think they think it's like an idol or something is another God. And we all have to be careful of that because there's so many temptations out there today that we have to beware of.
Absolutely. Most people would think that medicine isn't a god. But you rely on it. The first thing you go to when you're not feeling well, what is that?
The graven image. Getting ahead.
Yeah. Well, and Mrs. Eddy and Miscellany says modes of healing other than the spiritual and divine break the first commandment.
I remember as a child, I have some relatives who were, going to doctors, and I noticed this tendency for people to look to their doctors as if they were God. And like whatever they said, whatever you say, doctor, I'll do. And I was shocked because there was no questioning, they were just at the altar of medicine looking up to this doctor as if he knew everything. And, it really shocked me, and I thought it was so wrong. And can you imagine if people would have that same adoration for God as they have for their doctors and medicine? Wouldn't that be awesome?
I know. You're absolutely right. I've seen that too.
And think what a horrible position that puts the doctor in. Many of them are fine people who really do want to help mankind. And to put them in a position of being a god, it harms. It's 10 times more difficult for them.
There's also, God is one God. Doctors are millions. We have to get back to the one. Each doctor has their own idea for this.
The human mind.
Yeah.
But I think it's also, that's why Mrs. Eddy's extraordinary humility when she said, "Follow me as long as I follow Christ." I'm not quoting exactly, because there's so many pastors now who want the people they're teaching, some so wrongly, to look to them before God.
Yes.
Pastors, politicians, teachers, see it in every walk of life, don't you?
Trust in truth and have no other trust. A few years ago when Gary and I were driving in Florida, and it's just sprawling, a lot of new towns and things being built. You know what we saw being built, mainly, were huge medical centers. It used to be, you'd see churches. Every community had a church. It's one thing I do love in this area. I mean, we still have that. Plainfield was once known as the city of churches. And where we live now, it's like a little church steeple in every town. And they are being attended, thank God. But to see these new places being built in these huge medical centers, it is definitely a God, as Suzanne said, everybody running there right away, and they go a lot.
Yes.
All the time. Any little thing, any little tweak, any little anything. Got to go see my doctor, see what he says.
Or just a checkup, even if everything's fine.
Yep. and they love to look for things, and if they can't find something first, just give them a few weeks, and they'll come up with something because they like to find things. So, anyway.
And a lot of them are really pain clinics just for dishing out pain medications.
True.
A whole lot of those.
Yes, they are.
I know.
And if you think government has a lot of bureaucracy, just take a look at the medical field.
Right.
Yes,
almost every ad on television.
It over for you and run it for you.
And more, there are commercials on TV. Every commercial.
Every commercial.
Every commercial is a pill. Yeah, one after another. You know, and used to have one commercial. Now they got 5 of them, and they're all medical.
These fancy new names. I'm not, what is that?
And then in 3 or 4 years, there'll be a class action suit against that name you remember from a commercial a few years ago.
All of that is the false god, and then of course we have it in the education too, where everyone thinks that some kind of an education is your answer out of poverty or out of all kinds of things. You got to go to a certain school, you have to have a certain education, and
you'll be free.
Yeah, then you'll be free. And what did we talk about last week? About your finding your purpose, not looking and poring over the best school you think you should go to, finding out how you can serve and bless mankind. What is it that God would have you do? And these rules and principles work. They still work if applied. You just have to focus on it because you see everyone else clamoring for educational achievement. I mean, the sports world today is a god. The Hollywood industry, and it's so sad when people can quote who's the best football player, who all these, movie stars, and they know all about them, but you ask them about the commandments, and they know nothing.
The same as teaching the children about monsters and drawing monsters and all. Did they ever draw an angel? I mean, I was like, what kind of report is this?
Yeah. Yeah, filling up their heads with that stuff when they're like that.
No, I couldn't stand Star Wars and all that stuff when my child was growing, a little boy.
Yeah, you have to use discretion on what they're going to see. And also then, and now, this, all of the computers and your handheld devices, and certainly that is the god. People say they're so hooked, you can't get off reading. My son had recommended this book. I've read a little bit of it. It's called World Without Mind. Talks about Google, Facebook. They're just taking over the world. I mean, Google's ultimate intent is artificial intelligence. They want to create a brain. Oh, that's great, isn't it? What are we going to do with that? I mean, in some ways, Google, you Google anything and it comes up. And frankly, in many ways, I'm grateful for some of these modern advances. But when it goes to extreme...
Well, they can be useful. But if the thought is that there is intelligence in matter...
Exactly.
Then that's going to lead you down the wrong path.
And then when these systems get big, who's behind them?
That's the thing. Who is?
Right. And for what purpose will they be used?
you know, they used to have, and they probably still do, these movies with robots taking over the world. So that's not what we're interested in. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, the problem with AI is all it can ever be is like supercharged mortal mind.
Yeah, mortal mind.
It's just it's a fancy name for a computer program that does a lot of things, but it only does what it is told to do. It has no intelligence of its own, and it never can. So the name artificial intelligence is an oxymoron.
And there is no artificial intelligence. We go back to Mrs. Eddy's definition of intelligence and mind. This is why this science is so important, and why, I mean, how wise it is. We have Christian and science. It's all covered, folks. We've got it all covered.
I saw a really neat sign in front of a church that said something like, what if you kept your Bible as close as you do your iPhone? Because they're always worried about, where's my phone? Where's my phone? And I thought that was such a great point. What if we kept our Bible with us at all times?
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
That's like Betty's car bumper. Notice that if you stay close, are you this close to God or something?
Yes, yeah.
If you stay this close to Jesus.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so we can make the difference within ourselves by doing this ourselves and by turning to God, the one and only God, for everything, all our needs. He answers it all. There's nothing that God can't do. Whatever your problem is, the answer is in God. He's the source. He's the Google. You want Google? Well, you got it. And mind, with a capital M. By that I mean all-knowing, all-seeing, all-acting, all-loving, all-wise, eternal. This is Eddie's definition of God.
And the only source of intelligence.
The only source. Because you see, with God you get wisdom. I don't know how you can program wisdom into a computer.
You can't. Not a human thing.
Unless it's just a notification that says, be sure to ask God.
Note to self. Right?
So the importance of keeping these laws and not adulterating them in themselves. Spurgeon says to alter the law is to leave us all without law. There will be no standard. And you know, Jesus, he said that in the first place, our Lord Jesus declares that he did not come to abolish it, the law. His words are most expressed. Think not that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And Paul tells us with regard to the gospel, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yea, we establish the law. It's Romans 3. The gospel, and that's the New Testament, means the firm establishment and vindication of the law of God. Jesus did not come to change the law, but to explain it. And he does, doesn't he? He goes into your motives and your thoughts. He elaborates on it. Because recently there was some talk about a pastor who's evidently one of the second most popular, I say that word in quotes, in the United States. And he was making the argument of getting away from the Old Testament and the Commandments. Because all you need is the New Testament. It's all in there. Well, thank God we've learned here that the Old Testament is very, very, very important, and it is rich with lessons and certainly the commandments.
Well, Jesus said, "Ye err, not knowing the Scriptures," and he didn't have a New Testament. So what was he referring to?
Exactly. Thank you.
And the whole Bible is the Word of God.
It is.
It's like doing away with the foundation when you don't want to look at the Old Testament.
You have all the stories in the Old Testament about how God saved people.
Just incredible stories that we get so much from. Daniel, Joseph, Abraham. In her message for 1901, Mrs. Eddy talks about, she says, "I became early a child of the church, an eager lover and student of vital Christianity. Why I loved Christians of the old sort was I could not help from loving them. Full of charity and good works, busy with their master's business, they had no time or desire to defame their fellow man. God seemed to shield the whole world in their hearts, and they were willing to renounce all for him. When infidels assailed them, however, the courage of their convictions was seen. They were heroes in the strife. They armed quickly, aimed deadly, and spared no denunciation. Their convictions were honest, and they lived them. And the sermons their lives preached caused me to love their doctrine. The lives of those old-fashioned leaders of religion explain in a few words a good man. They fill the ecclesiastic measure that to love God and keep his commandments is the whole duty of man. Such churchmen and the Bible, especially the first commandment of the Decalogue and the 91st Psalms, the Sermon on the Mount, and St. John's Revelation, educated my thought many years, yea, all the way up to its preparation for and reception of the science of Christianity. I believe if those venerable Christians were here today, their sanctified souls would take in the spirit and understanding of Christian science through the floodgates of love. With them, love was the governing impulse of every action. Their piety was the all-important consideration of their being, the original beauty of holiness that today seems to be fading so sensibly from our sight. I have always loved that description that she had of the people she knew as a child and what examples they were. And they were living this, and they were living the Ten Commandments. And that imbibed in her something wonderful that sprang forth later with the science of Christianity. And we can certainly emulate those people today. There's no reason why we can't. If we live it and love it as they did. That's why, you read Charles Spurgeon, some of these, Matthew Henry. They really understood the Bible. A lot of our commentaries. These people loved it and lived it. And it was relevant. And so it should be to us. See anyone else on this first commandment?
If you look at Hebrews 11, where they have the basically the huge list of the heroes in the faith, which you referred to a couple of minutes ago, this long thing about by faith they overcame this and Joseph and all the incredible stories that we were referring to in the Old Testament, and then the first sentence in Hebrews 12 is. It's so wonderful. It just encapsulates what you're saying. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, that's all the heroes of the faith. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. The Old Testament is there for our encouragement. It's there so we can lay aside the sin which so easily ensnares us and run with endurance the race that is set before us. And how someone can say, it's just beyond me, that we don't need the Old Testament desperately is just insanity, in my opinion. I mean, I think about the lessons we've had recently about Daniel, and I weep sometimes reading those stories. Just these incredible people and the way they trusted God, in the furnace and with the lions, and Moses taking millions of people out into the desert. I mean, from a human perspective, that's just sheer insanity. But from God's point of view, I'm going to make me a nation, and that's what He did. And I just love that first verse in Hebrews 12 that tells us why we have this cloud of witnesses.
Thank you so much.
That's exactly right.
Yes, it is.
And that should speak to each one of us.
Yes, it does. Because when you look at that list, to me, it really magnifies God. It just gets a certain feeling I can't explain, but it really, it does something to me.
Yeah, the encouragement. It's as if we're standing with all those saints, the cloud of witnesses, all these people who have testified to God on one mighty shout. This is what we do Wednesdays. One mighty shout up to the heavens, praising God, what He has done, what He has done, what He is still doing. They say, if you're ever confronted with something, a storm or war, anything, you start singing, you start praising God. What you do.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, sometimes I get people saying, I just can't trust God, and there's doubting. I mean, read some of these. Read some of these, what He has done. To me, that's the answer. The only power.
Yes, it is. But Mrs. Eddy calls it the scale. How much time are you thinking? Oh, look at this terrible life, all this stuff. I mean, if that scale is pretty darn heavy, yeah, you're not going to have any faith. Or do you put it on the other side, praising God, thanking God, counting your blessings, remembering all He's done, reading the Bible? Which scale are you? Are you Eeyore? Or are you?
We do have a choice of where we hold thought, don't we? She says, hold thought steadfastly.
It's all right. No. Yeah.
To the enduring, the good, and the true.
They will
bring these into your experience.
Proportionally to the occupancy of your thought.
There you have it.
You can't skip over that, folks. And you don't ever, I've maintained, and I speak for myself too, you don't just wake up one morning and feel, miserable, depressed, all of that. You've been working on it. You've been cultivating this. Your scale is really hanging on that other side. It just didn't happen. So let's catch it when it's early on. And remember, you're disobeying the first commandment. You are, and if you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps, recognizing that, get back to praising God and thanking God and knowing He is the one and only power, you will prove it in your life. This isn't just to be talked about. You should have the results, the fruitage of it.
And that's the whole point of the commandment, is to make our lives what God created. Perfect and eternal. It's the ideal we should be holding before our thoughts. It should be what we should be striving for. And the instructions are right there over and over again in the Bible. That's why I love these Bible studies.
I'm so grateful because they've gotten a lot more views and people joining us. We're so glad you're here. And again, remember, E. Kroger, article site, the cause of all loss and suffering is not because of matter being diseased or whatever, but because of the breaking of the commandment. Thou shalt have no other God before me. Hear it.
He's so right.
So, keep that first commandment. Keep whatever your problem is separate from a belief in matter, and restore it back to mind where it belongs, and all fear and suffering depart. The power of our first commandment. Thank God for it. Thank God for Mrs. Eddy for saying how tremendous it is, teaching us what it is. Not just to think it's, well, you're not supposed to have a graven image in your house, some picture or idol or something. Wow, is it more than that? As are all these commandments, this one particularly. Okay, we have an hour now, and we have the rest of this commandments to go over.
That's all right. We knew it would be more than one.
I'm sure.
Okay. Well, thank you, Shardy.
Thank you, Shardy.
Thank you, Shardy.
Thank you all.
This is a
Thank you very much.
Bye. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.